Today's Gospel is taken from St. Matthew, chapter 13, verses 24 to 30 and 36 to 43. Jesus told a parable to the crowd. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed ears, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burnt. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Then Jesus left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burnt in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out the kingdom and everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear." Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that we can't be with you live this morning and that this is a recording. I thought I'd just share a few very personal thoughts about today's Gospel reading. I always find the parables quite difficult to understand. Last week's was perhaps easier. We all know as gardeners the importance of choosing the right soil if we are sowing seeds, and therefore the comparison seemed to work well. Today's isn't quite as easy as that. In this parable, we're told that we need to leave the weeds until the harvest. Now, as many of you know, my husband Jean-Marc is a keen gardener. And every time we go away on holiday or away for a week, he always tries to make sure he has pulled up the weeds before we go and before there is any danger of them coming to seed. He always says if he leaves them, then we will have those weeds in the garden for several years to come. So he wouldn't really be in favour, as a gardener, of doing what we're told in the parable. And that led me to thinking. I'm always very aware that the Bible we read is a translation, and there are many translations. It used to be a little bit of a standing joke with our dear friend Paul Glaister, who always liked the authorized version, the King James's version. And I like to point out to him passages which made very little sense to the modern reader. But this time round, I thought I'd go back and have a look at what King James's version said. And of course, immediately I turned to the passage I remembered from my childhood, the story of the wheat and the tares, Tares isn't a word we use much today, but it does designate a certain kind of weed, and it's sometimes also replaced in translations by another more specific term called darnel. And what's being referred to here is a very special type of weed that looks like wheat. Sometimes it's also translated as ryegrass, which you may have come across if you've sown your own lawn. And so basically, unless you leave that particular weed to mature, there is no way of knowing when it first sprouts whether it is good or bad grain. And so pulling it up early on runs the risk of pulling up the good seed or grain. And of course, if we take that gardening metaphor a little bit further, then we could also argue that sometimes some weeds put down their roots so far into the ground and entangle themselves so much with that beautiful plant we paid so much for at the local gardening centre. And therefore, it's dangerous to try to pull one up without harming the other. And that led me to thinking a little bit further, because we often tend to put things, people, into categories. We like to put people in boxes, to label them. We tend to see the world sometimes in terms of black and white. And I know I often annoy my students by pointing out that even language is fuzzy. And although they might like me to say, well, you can only say this and you can't say that, I tend usually to say to them, well, normally we don't say that, but if you look on the internet, you're bound to find one variety of English where you can actually do that. And I'm a great believer in grey areas, even if, like everyone else, unfortunately, I fall into the trap of seeing things sometimes in black and white. But life and people are more complex than that. And so perhaps we need to avoid making judgments, and especially hasty judgments. The servants in the parable are told to wait. They're told to be patient until the harvest. Both weeds and wheat are allowed to grow together, and the decision on what to pull up and when is a decision that lies with the master. It's so easy, isn't it, sometimes to think that if only so-and-so wasn't part of such a project, it might be easier to bring it to fruition. Or if society didn't have that particular category of person, maybe the economy would work better, etc. I always remember one of my relations organising what was supposed to be the perfect wedding. It was supposed to be a perfect day for her. And so a number of measures were taken, including not inviting a very elderly relative who was deemed to be a little bit problematic, might say the wrong thing in the wrong place, and was also going to be, would need extra care, etc. And so that person wasn't invited. But perfection is not about excluding. In fact, if we get rid of everything we might perceive as weeds, we risk being left with something which is empty and dead. By pulling up the weeds and risking pulling up what's good, we could end up with an empty field. We may foolishly exclude the wheat, the good grain. And don't forget that many of the plants we label as weeds when we're gardeners are labelled as wildflowers elsewhere. And so it seems to me that this parable is especially challenging to me. It's telling me personally not to be so quick about judging, I think, to be a little bit more patient. And if I can do that, then maybe I'll have learned something today.